Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History by Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Bible scholar Professor Ben Witherington III. For those that aren't familiar with him, Ben Witherington III is Amos Professor of New Testament for Doctoral Studies at Asbury Theological Seminary and on the doctoral faculty at St. Andrews University in Scotland. A graduate of UNC Chapel Hill, he went on to receive the Master's of Divinity degree from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and a PhD from the University of Durham in England. He is now considered one of the top evangelical scholars in the world and is an elected member of the prestigious SNTS, a society dedicated to New Testament studies. Witherington has also taught at Ashland Theological Seminary, Vanderbilt University Duke Divinity School, and Gordon Conwell. A popular lecturer, Witherington has presented seminars for churches, colleges, and biblical meetings not only in the United States, but also in England, Estonia, Russia, Europe, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Australia. He has also led tours to Italy, Greece, Turkey, Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. Witherington has written over 60 books, including The Jesus Quest and The Paul Quest, both of which were selected as top biblical studies works by Christianity Today. He also writes for many church and scholarly publications and is a frequent contributor to the Patheos website. In 2020, he won the AAP Prose Award in Theology and Religious Studies for Biblical Theology, the Convergence of the Canon, Cambridge University Press 2020. Along with many interviews on radio networks across the country, Witherington has been seen on the History Channel, NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, the Discovery Channel, A&E, and the PAX network. So welcome to History Valley Podcast, Professor Ben Witherington III.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Good to have you here. So I'd like to start us off with, why do scholars claim that 1, 2 Timothy and Titus, or why do many scholars declare them to be forgeries, pseudepigrapha, not written by Paul, and why are they called the Pastoral Epistles?
Well, first of all, the grammar and syntax and vocabulary of pastoral epistles are different from the capital Paulines that everyone agrees are by Paul. And so that's one of the main reasons in and of itself why people say that. My own view of that is that if you actually study all of the writers of the New Testament, in fact, the theology in the pastoral epistles, the vocabulary, the grammar, and the style is very much like what you find in Luke Acts. For example, there are 42 words or phrases in those short pastoral epistles that do not occur anywhere else in the New Testament except in Luke Acts. So there's not a problem with the idea that one of Paul's co-workers actually composed these letters, in this case, Luke. And we are actually told in 2 Timothy that the only person that is with Paul is Luke. So I think that, those who see this as non-Pauline simply because of grammar, syntax, vocabulary have not adequately considered that perhaps, since we already know Paul used scribes to compose his letters, we have Tertius mentioned in Romans 16, there's no reason why Paul might not use a co-worker whom he trusted to compose these documents, especially 2 Timothy, when Paul is really in prison. So somebody else is actually doing the writing on his behalf.
So you're saying that essentially what we've kind of got here is co-authors of us in a sense. And would you say that they can explain some of the apparent contradictions? Could we be getting different points of view from these people, possibly?
Well, it's not impossible, but I don't think that's the case of what we've got with pastoral epistles. I think that the person who composed this is not trying to do his own thing. He's not trying to write his own conclusions about Timothy or Titus or the pastoral situation there. He's trying to do what Paul asked him to do. Now, sometimes when Paul used scribes, he simply offered dictation to the scribe, and the scribe took it down. And you can see that in some of Paul's letters. For example, in 1 Corinthians, you have incomplete sentences in various places. In other words, Paul is dictating quickly, and the scribe is not able to take it down as quickly as it's being dictated. Not a big deal. That was typical of ancient writing anyway. And in the case of the composition of the pastoral epistles, it reflects not a different theology or a different ethic than Paul. It simply reflects a different grammatical and syntactical and vocabulary style. So what that means is that the person who composed this is somebody Paul trusted to compose it in his own way, in his own language.
Can you tell us a bit about the church fathers attesting to the pastoral epistles?
Sure. Um, all these letters were considered to be from the mind of Paul. There's not a case to be made that there were church fathers who thought, well, no, these are not Paul's letters. Um, uh, and what's interesting about this is that the collection of Paul's letters was already underway in the first century AD. I mean, we have the statement in 2 Peter 3 about all of Paul's letters. So what we know is that, within the first century AD, there was already a collection of Paul's letters. And when we begin to have canon lists, like the Muratorian canon list, these documents are mentioned. They're not left out. Or in the earliest codexes we have, Codex Sinaiticus or Alexandrinus, these documents are in and are considered Pauline. So there really isn't a case to be made that some church fathers thought it wasn't by Paul.
Did anyone in the ancient world claim it wasn't by Paul?
Sure, absolutely. There was a heretical bishop in the second century named Marcion who didn't like any of the Old Testament, went with no gospels except Luke's gospel, and then only his own personal selection of Paul's letters. So, yes, there were such people, but that did not represent the consensus of opinion of church fathers.
Is Paul's theology in the pastorals consistent with his other epistles?
First of all, these documents are basically practical advice in ethics.
Hmm.
There's not a lot of theology in the pastoral epistles. So, for example, let's take an example. The term that's regularly used in the pastoral epistles for Christ is Savior, which is a term that Luke regularly uses already in the early part of his gospel and on into the book of Acts. Paul himself doesn't use that term. Most of the time, he simply calls him Christ Jesus or Jesus Christ or Lord or those kinds of things. Uh, it's a different vocabulary. It's not a different person or a different idea. So I don't really think there's anything in the theology of the pastoral epistles that is at odds with Paul's earlier letters. And in fact, some of it's very much right in tune with Paul's view. For example, you have in the pastoral epistles the idea that Jesus Christ was the mediator between God and human beings who gave his life as a ransom for all. Okay, that's clearly Pauline theology. It's right there, and it's just being reiterated in a different way in the pastoral epistles.
Is the language of the pastorals like the other Pauline epistles?
I've already said no.
Hmm.
It's often not like the language of the other Pauline epistles. It's like the language of Luke and Acts, but that's not particularly important.
Can you tell us about Titus containing Greco-Roman ethical material normed and modified in the light of Christ, of the Christ event and the emergent Christian tradition?
Sure. Um, probably the earliest of these pastoral epistles is the letter to Titus, and that may be why it's first of the three that are put together as a collection and called the pastoral epistles. And the reason they're called the pastoral epistles is because they're pastoral advice from Paul to two of his co-workers, two of his closest co-workers, Titus and Timothy. And so that's why they are entitled what they are by later folks. I mean, the documents themselves don't call themselves the pastoral epistles. This is a title added to the documents after the fact to distinguish them from some of Paul's letters that are written to communities. These are the only letters of Paul not written to a community, clearly not written to a community. Even Philemon is written to Philemon and the church that meets in his house. So that's one of the things that absolutely distinguishes these three documents from the earlier Pauline letters. And that also explains the difference in some of the content as well.
Those who believe the pastorals to be non-Pauline tend to argue the pastorals contain a more advanced church structure than the authentic ones do. How do you respond to that argument?
Well, I would have to say I don't think they read Philippians because Philippians is very clear that not only are there deacons and not only are the elders, deacons are mentioned in Romans 16, elders are mentioned in several of Paul's letters, but we even hear about presbyteroi. Now you can translate that word either overseers or bishops. Either way, it's something that reflects um, the practice in some of Paul's churches. So I don't think the church structure in the pastoral epistles is in any way notably different. And in any case, what we're talking about here is church planting in Crete, for example, with Titus, and in Ephesus with Timothy. And so we're talking about fledgling communities that Timothy and Titus are involved in. We really have no evidence that Paul ever went to Crete, for example. And so the advice he's giving to one of his coworkers who's doing something that Paul himself didn't do. In the case of Timothy, he probably is dealing with some churches that Paul, in his 2.5 years in Ephesus, founded, but probably also some new churches as well. And so the church situation in both cases is not identical to what Paul had encountered earlier in his ministry.
Titus seems to criticize genealogies, but in Romans 1 and elsewhere, Paul seems to care about Jesus being a descendant of King David, and even so in 2 Timothy. So what is the deal there?
When we're talking about genealogies, what we're talking about in the pastoral epistles is Jewish genealogies, not the genealogy of Jesus himself, but various ways that Jews settled issues of ancestry and authority. And I don't think it has anything to do with a critique of Jesus himself's genealogy.
Can you tell us about Paul's Imperial Rhetoric and Christian ethics in Titus?
Sure. One of the things Paul is careful about, let's go back to Romans 13 for a minute, is he wants this new Christian movement to survive. At the same time, he's concerned about the rising cult of the emperor, namely, that people who are not simply Jews were all supposed to, whether they're Gentiles or God-fearers, they were all supposed to be able to worship the emperor. And this kind of cult was, in fact, the only sort of evangelistic religion in the Roman world that was a new religion, like Christianity was a new religion. And so, on the one hand, Paul wants to make clear that there's a person named Christ who's above and beyond all powers and principalities. But at the same time, he wants Christians to respect the governing authorities of the Roman Empire and not cause an unnecessary problem for the churches in any way. And so he says, submit to the governing authorities in Romans 13. He's quite clear about that.
One Timothy says that women should be silent in churches and cannot lead in them. Those opposed to authenticity will argue that this is that is one of the major reasons to dismiss the letter and say it is non-Pauline, and they'll tend to link it with 1 Corinthians 14:34 to 35, which they also say is an interpolation. How do you respond to all of that?
Well, I've done that at length. I've written commentaries on all of these books. And my answer to that is wrong and wrong. What's going on in First Timothy is a particular problem. It's a problem with socially elite women. This is why he mentions bling. This is why he mentions fancy dress. And what we know about socially elite women in Ephesus is that often they were teachers or priestesses in the cult of Artemis. So, what we're talking about is Gentile women who had been converted to Christ and simply assumed that they could assume the same roles in early Christian household meetings as they had had previously in their other religions. And Paul does not say they should be silent. He says they should be quiet, hesukia, in 1 Timothy 2. And he also doesn't say they're not allowed to teach or etc. He says, I am not now permitting them to teach and usurp authority over the existing teachers who are authorized by me, namely, in this case, Timothy, to do the teaching in this particular case. Now, if you read on in that same document, you would discover that he also says that the older women should be training the younger women. So it's not about women teaching in general. It's about new converts not assuming roles of teaching before they learn. What Paul says is they should listen and they should learn. And the verb epitrepho there never means I would never permit. It never means that. It always in the present Greek tense, it always means I am not now permitting. There's a reason why, and he gives the reason why they need to learn before they would even attempt to teach. They need to listen before they choose to speak. And I mean, one of the things we certainly know about the social situation of a mixed group is that the socially more elite people were the more literate people, the more well-educated people, and they were the ones that were more likely to speak up anyhow. In the case of of 1 Corinthians 14:33b to 36, I don't think it's an interpolation. There's no evidence for its absence from any manuscript. There is evidence that it was placed after verse 40 in some manuscripts. That's displacement, not elimination. So there's no manuscript that doesn't have these. And I would say that if you bother to actually read the context in 1 Corinthians 14, those verses make complete sense. He's already used the verb sagao, to silence, when people were interrupting prophets when they were speaking. He says, let one speak and others be silent while they're speaking. But the real giveaway here is when Paul says, if any of you women have questions, ask your questions at home. Now, that's a dead giveaway that we're dealing with Gentile, Greek speaking women who are used to thinking of prophecy not in a biblical way, but in light of the oracle at Delphi and other such Greco Roman kinds of contexts for prophecy. when you had a question, you went to the oracle and asked the question. So these women are assuming that since there's prophecy going on in this house church, they can ask questions. No, says Paul, you need to listen, be silent while the prophets are doing what they're doing, and learn. And that's, I think, exactly the right advice. So in both the cases of 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians 14, he's correcting particular problems. And in response to all of that, I would say, abusus non tollit usum, which means the abuse of a privilege doesn't rule out its proper use. Elsewhere, Paul commends women for teaching and speaking and being deacons and even being an apostle. In Romans 16:7, Junia is labeled as an apostle, who's one of his co-workers who ended up in jail for testifying about Christ. So the problem is not women teaching or preaching. The problem is women behaving inappropriately during the Christian worship service and needing correction on those two issues.
So essentially, they would be allowed to teach as they learned more later. So Paul
Yes,
never
exactly.
said, never
Exactly.
forever.
Yes, it's not about banning them from teaching. And were that the case, then we would have a contradiction. Because elsewhere in Paul's letters and in Acts 18, we see, for example, Priscilla teaching Apollos along with her husband Aquila.
Hmm.
So, I mean, pick your poison here. You want to say this is banning women from speaking? Well, guess what? Then you're contradicting things Paul says in his earlier letters, and it's also at odds with what the Book of Acts says about women who were in Paul's churches.
So why then do they claim that these things say that all women should be quiet like forever? Well, why do they take it in that context then? Why do they say that?
Well, I kind of like to put it this way. The problem in the church is not strong, gifted women. The problem in the church is weak men who can't handle strong, gifted women. What we know about those cultures is they are overwhelmingly patriarchal, overwhelmingly patriarchal. And so when you have women who are more educated or more socially elite, who are gifted by God to do this, that, and the other, there would be men who saw that as a threat. And there are men today in the church who see that as a threat. And that's one of the reasons they say, no, women shouldn't be doing that. And at the root of this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Bible actually says about the roles of men and women. In the family, obviously, there are gender differences in roles. I mean, I would like to have taken one for the team when it was coming to the time for our second child to be born, but I don't have the equipment to do that. In the physical family, there are gender specific roles. Of course, there are. That's very clear. But the roles in the family of faith are not determined by gender. They're determined by who's called and who's gifted to do particular jobs. So there is this confusion that the role in the physical family must carry over into the church. And therefore, there are gender specific roles in the church. Well, no, there is no text in the Bible that says that. And in fact, we know that there were plenty of women in Paul's own ministry. The one person who is claimed to have taken objections to women doing teaching, we know there were women in Paul's own ministry who were his co-workers, whether we're thinking of Junia or Priscilla or Phoebe. I mean, we could just keep going. And so obviously there's something wrong with the reading of Paul that suggests that women are not supposed to teach or preach or do this and the other. And the real problem is predicating gender specific roles in the church, which only apply to the physical family.
Why do some scholars consider 1 Timothy 3:14 the caesura of the letter?
Why don't you read that and we'll talk about it?
Hmm. Can you tell us about Josephus informing us of a large Jewish presence in Ephesus and its antiquities? Does it help us at all to understand the differences between 1 Timothy and the other Pauline epistles?
Well, there was a large Jewish presence in a lot of places that Paul went. Antioch would be one. Pisidian Antioch would be one. Iconium would be one. We could keep going. There were plenty of Jews in Corinth. We've even found the synagogue inscription in Corinth as well. So I don't think Ephesus is a particular example of having a large Jewish presence compared to various of these other places. I think wherever Paul went, there was some kind of Jewish presence. Now, probably the least would be Philippi, because there isn't a synagogue there. He goes down by the river to find the Jewish meeting when he runs into Lydia and her family and others who are praying by the river. But I don't think that really the Jewish presence in Ephesus, I don't think is the main issue as to what's going on. What we do here in the book of Acts is that he runs into what we would call non-typical Jews, Jewish sorcerers. We run into them trying to perform exorcisms in the name of Jesus. We run into other kinds of false prophets and teachers of various sorts. So Ephesus was one of the four largest cities in the ancient world. And there were all kinds of religions and all kinds of religious groups in Ephesus. And so planting a Christian movement there, it was important. The real people who objected to him were people of pagan religion, the silversmith and others. So, I don't think the Jewish presence in Ephesus is all that terribly significant in explaining what's going on in Ephesians.
What does 2 Timothy tell us about Paul's opponents in Ephesus and their teachings?
Well, what it tells us is that there are multiple other religious groups in Ephesus. And the problem is syncretism. Well, what's syncretism? Syncretism is the attempt to blend together some kind of Greco-Roman religion with some kind of Jewish religion. And this was not just a problem at Ephesus, it was a problem elsewhere as well. It was a problem for Jews, uh, plain old Jews. The Hellenizing of Jews led to them doing some strange things. If you go to Sardis, to the archaeological site at Sardis, you will discover a mosaic floor which has images of not just Jewish Hebrews like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but also Hellenistic figures as well that are not Jews. By the way, you have the same problem at Sepphoris in Galilee. So we're talking about Hellenized Jews. And some Jews were so Hellenized that their children even tried to have the evidence of their being circumcised removed so they could play in Olympic Games. This is how Hellenized some Jews were. So, one of the things that Paul, of course, has to deal with is all different kinds of Jews, very traditional Jews, non traditional Jews, Jews who had compromised the way they looked at culture because of the influence of the Greek language and Hellenistic culture. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of things going on. And syncretism affected Judaism just as it did these other religions.
What does 2 Timothy tell us about apostasy and corruption in the last days?
Well, one of the things that is important that Paul tells us that it's possible for people who have believed in Jesus Christ to commit apostasy. For example, we hear about Hymenaeus and one other former believer, who have made shipwreck of the faith. Now, you can't make shipwreck of something you've never had. And Paul doesn't use the term faith there any differently than he does elsewhere in the Pastoral Epistles or in his capital Pauline letters. So certainly apostasy is possible, and not just in the last days. Apostasy is possible in any age of church history. The author of Hebrews is warning against this in Hebrews 6 as well, somewhere in the middle of the first century AD, maybe in the mid-60s AD. So there was a great concern, not just on the part of Paul, but also Peter and others, about false teachers, false prophets, and people committing apostasy. Now, what is apostasy? Apostasy is not, it should not be termed losing your faith, like you'd lose your glasses. Oh, I had my faith here somewhere. Is it under the chair? No, no. Apostasy is a willful, knowing rejection of the work of God in your life. That's what apostasy is. And Paul believes it's certainly possible for believers to do that. The author of Hebrews believes this. The author of 1 John believes this. Very definitely, the author of Revelation 2 and 3 believes this because he keeps warning Christians against it. So this was a danger because here is a tiny minority religion surrounded by polytheism, all kinds of other pagan religions. No wonder there's this concern about the danger of them committing apostasy. And it's not a matter of losing something. It's a matter of throwing away your commitment to Christ.
Why do some scholars argue that the way Paul understands faith in the pastorals is different from the other letters?
Well, that's a good question. You'd have to ask them. I don't think it is. I mean, salvation by grace through faith in Jesus is what you find just as much in the pastoral epistles as you find in the early Pauline letters. So I don't really think that's true. Christ is just as much the one and only Savior between God and humankind in the pastoral epistles as he is in the early Pauline letters. But you have to remember, these are practical letters. You should not expect the whole theology of Romans to show up in the pastoral epistles. For one thing, Timothy and Titus will have heard this before. They would have heard all those things before. What they needed was practical help with their pastoral ministry, which is what these letters are giving them.
Why do you think that Luke was Paul's amanuensis involved in composing the pastoral epistles?
Because the language, the syntax, and the vocabulary is Lucan again and again on page after page. I mean, when I tell you that there are 42 words out of about 160 different words in the pastoral epistle that are not found anywhere else in the New Testament except in Luke Acts, that is a red flag right there that these are clearly, this is something that Luke is doing, and it reflects Luke's style. And we are told in 1 Timothy 2, Luke alone is with me. Now, what's interesting about that is that the letter most like the earlier Pauline letters is 2 Timothy, where Luke is clearly involved. And yet it's also the case that we can look at Titus or 1 Timothy and see the very same style and syntax and vocabulary use.
Does the parallels between Acts and the pastoral epistles are there even some of them reflected in what is called the we sections of Acts?
That's an excellent question. That's a very good question. But what I would remind you about Acts is that what Luke is doing is presenting Paul as the evangelist and church planter. What we have in Paul's letters is Paul addressing those who are already Christians. This is very different. So the one place that actually we have a letter, have a speech by Paul that sounds like the Paul of the letters is his speech to the Ephesian elders when he's talking to Christians. That's really it. The earlier speeches in Acts 13 are to Jews, and the same applies at Pisidian Antioch or Iconium and elsewhere. And so we would not expect that the theological content and the speeches we find of Paul addressing new potential converts would be the same as the language in the pastoral epistles when he's writing to two co-workers who have been faithful Christians for some period of time. We wouldn't expect that. But the we passages in Acts help us in this regard. Some of the personalia mentioned in the pastoral epistles is also mentioned in Acts. And some of the destinations or places that we hear in the book, in the pastoral epistles, is also mentioned in the book of Acts in the we sections. So there's some crossover, but mainly the crossover has to do with destinations and co-workers and that sort of thing.
So based on what you've said, the differences, the supposed differences in style and the presence of Greek words in the pastorals that are not in the other letters of Paul are not as disturbing as one should imagine them to be. Once you understand the parallels between Acts and the pastorals, as you've pointed out, it clears all that up.
Well, I don't know that it would completely satisfy persons, but what's interesting to me is that the person who wrote the sort of definitive book on this, Stephen Wilson, who was a doctoral student at Durham with the same professor I studied with, C.K. Barrett, before I was there, wrote a little book called Luke and the Pastoral Epistles, where he lines out all these parallels between Luke Acts and the Pastoral Epistles for 180 or 200 pages. The interesting thing about that is, I mean, he's not a conservative Christian person. He would be more like the liberal scholars who have suggested that the pastorals are not by Paul. But what he's saying is that when you actually look at the evidence, well, it looks like these documents are written by a co-worker of Paul who knew Paul intimately. And I think that's exactly right. So, I mean, in a sense, he's an outside the conservative church witness that this is the right way to go.
That's fascinating. Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Ben Witherington III.
You're welcome. I'm very happy to be with you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.